Welcome, dear listener, to another cozy mystery in the gentle, winding lanes of the English countryside. Today, we return to the beloved village of St. Mary Mead, where gardens bloom, teacups clink, and beneath the quiet charm, secrets lie waiting to be uncovered. This is Miss Marple and the Secret Game of the Schoolmistress, a Miss Marple story. Our tale will unfold in 10 chapters, so make yourself comfortable, pour a warm cup of tea, and join Miss Marple as she once again proves that the smallest details often hide the largest truths. Chapter 1. A Puzzling Discovery. The village of St. Mary Mead, nestled amidst the rolling green fields of the English countryside, had a way of making one believe that nothing more dramatic than a parish fête or a jam shortage might ever disturb its peace. Its crooked lanes were lined with thatched cottages and climbing roses, its shops small and dignified in their time-worn brick, and its church spire rose modestly above the chestnut trees. For most of its inhabitants, life moved with the comforting predictability of church bells on Sundays and Mrs. Hartwell's scones on Fridays. Yet, beneath its tranquil exterior, St. Mary Mead was a place of keen observation, sharp gossip, and, if one were to listen carefully, an undercurrent of secrets. And no one listened more carefully or more intelligently than Miss Jane Marple, a genteel, elderly spinster with white hair, bright blue eyes, and the manner of one who might appear to do nothing but knit, all while seeing everything. It was late September, and the morning air was crisp, touched with the faint scent of wood smoke. Miss Marple sat by her parlor window, a neat basket of knitting by her side, when her friend and occasional sparring partner, Mrs. Price Ridley, stopped by for elevenses. The two ladies shared a pot of tea, accompanied by thin slices of seed cake. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to delay the sharing of news, leaned forward with her customary air of severity. "Have you heard, Miss Marple? That new schoolmistress, Miss Phil, whirring." "How very curious," she said mildly. "Blackmail is a most ungenerous occupation. It requires both knowledge and a certain lack of scruples, two qualities I do not often associate with primary education." Mrs. Price Ridley gave a sharp sniff. "Well, it only proves what I've said all along. These modern ways, these newfangled games and progressive notions, they only encourage dishonesty, riddles and secret contests. It's not what we had in my day, and we were all the better for it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. She rather doubted that riddles led naturally to criminal acts, but she did not argue. Instead, she asked gently, "And what is the nature of this secret game?" "I believe it was Miss Finch's own invention." "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Price Ridley with an air of distaste. "Each week she sets little puzzles or riddles for her pupils, keeps the answers locked in that box, and awards a prize to the winner. Trifles such as pencils, or sometimes more expensive things. A silver fountain pen this time, I hear. Nonsense, if you ask me. Encouraging ambition in children where there ought to be humility." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Children do enjoy puzzles, though. It must be quite diverting for them, and a silver pen is a tempting treasure." Her eyes grew dreamy, but behind the softness lay a sharp intelligence. "A box broken, a prize missing, and a note of blackmail," she mused. "One wonders who the true player of this game might be." By noon, the village was alive with chatter. At the grocer's, at the post office, even at the green where old Major Horton was seen clipping roses, tongues wagged about Miss Finch's misfortune. Some said the matter was merely mischief, the work of a naughty schoolboy. Others hinted at darker things, suggesting Miss Finch's secret game had not been so innocent after all. Miss Marple, with her usual unobtrusive manner, strolled toward the schoolhouse that afternoon. The building stood modestly at the edge of the village green, ivy clambering over its stone walls. Through the open windows drifted the faint scent of chalk and ink. The children had been dismissed. Interest in matters of little mysteries. Gardening, knitting, and puzzles, too, in their way. The vicar, knowing Miss Marple's reputation for uncovering truths hidden from sterner eyes, nodded his consent. And so Miss Finch led her into the classroom. The room smelled faintly of chalk dust and linseed oil. Sunlight slanted through tall windows, falling across rows of wooden desks. At the front stood the teacher's desk, upon which rested the remains of a small wooden chest. It had once been stout and serviceable, but now the lid hung broken, its lock wrenched cruelly aside. Splinters littered the floor, and the brass hasp dangled at an awkward angle. Miss Marple bent carefully, her eyes twinkling, though her face remained serene. "Yes," she murmured. "Forced, not opened. A very hasty sort of business." Beside the shattered box lay a folded paper. Miss Finch, flustered, handed it to her. The paper was crumpled, the ink scrawled in a hurried, uneven hand. "If you do not give what is asked, more will be said. Secrets should not be paraded before children. Destroy the letters, or worse will follow." Miss Marple's expression gave nothing away. She read it once, then again, and finally folded it neatly. "How very forthright," she said softly. "And the prize? The fountain pen?" "Gone," said Miss Finch, "though I hardly care about that. It is the note, the implication, that troubles me most." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "It must indeed. One hopes, however, that the implication is false. Blackmailers are rarely accurate, though they rely upon fear to make their prey believe otherwise." Miss Finch colored slightly but said nothing. Miss Marple rose, her eyes falling upon the littered floor. Among the splinters and paper scraps, she noticed a small round object glinting faintly. She bent and picked it up. It was a button, brass, well polished, of the kind found on coats rather than children's uniforms. She turned it between her fingers before slipping it discreetly into her handkerchief. Buttons, she thought, were very much like people on. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind turning. His dislike of the secret game was plain enough. Yet, dislike was one thing, blackmail quite another. Still, it was a useful piece of the puzzle. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and reflected on all she had learned. The peaceful rhythms of St. Mary Mead had once again been disturbed by something sharp and troubling beneath the surface. She thought of Miss Finch, earnest and clever, yet clearly harboring some anxiety about her past. She thought of the stern organist, the watchful Mrs. Price Ridley, the mischievous schoolboy Peter Hollis, and timid Miss Clara Sims, the assistant teacher who had looked as though she might faint when the box was mentioned. Each had crossed her mind during her walk. A fountain pen gone missing, a broken box, a blackmail note, and a brass button lying silently on the classroom floor. A puzzle indeed, Miss Marple murmured to herself, settling into her chair. Her needles resumed their steady click, but her mind was already several steps ahead, weaving connections where others saw only confusion. The secret game, she thought, had just taken on an entirely new meaning. And with that, the first threads of mystery began to knit themselves into a pattern only she would be clever enough to unravel. Chapter 2. Meeting the Suspects. The next morning in St. Mary Mead dawned with a pale mist hanging low over the meadows, softening the outlines of hedgerows and making the cobblestones glisten with dampness. The villagers, as was their custom, were already speaking of little else but the incident at the schoolhouse. As Miss Marple stepped out to fetch a jug of milk from the dairy, she could hear fragments of speculation drifting on the air like autumn leaves. Everyone, it seemed, had their theory. Miss Marple did not linger in the chatter of the lane, though she listened with her usual keen attention. She intended to make her own observations, in her own quiet manner. The discovery of the brass button still sat neatly wrapped in her hand, accepted the offered chair, her knitting bag resting on her lap. Her kindly eyes observed Miss Finch closely, noting the nervous way she twisted her handkerchief. "Village tongues do wag most dreadfully," she said gently. "It is not the first time, nor will it be the last. Tell me, my dear, who had access to the box?" Miss Finch pressed her lips together. "In truth, only myself. I kept the key upon my desk drawer. The children submitted their answers to the riddles, and I locked them away until I could mark them. The prizes, too, were stored there. I thought it all quite secure." "And yet," said Miss Marple mildly, "someone considered it worthwhile to force it open. A desperate act, surely, for a fountain pen." Miss Finch lowered her eyes. "I fear the pen was not the only object of interest. There was also a letter I had hoped never to see again." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her bag, though she had not lifted them. "Ah," she said kindly. "Letters are very much like ghosts. They have a tiresome way of appearing just when one wishes them most firmly to stay buried." Miss Finch gave her a startled glance, but said no more. It was enough for Miss Marple. The schoolmistress's troubled heart was plain to see. When she left the lodgings, Miss Marple allowed her mind to turn to others whose names had already been whispered. The stern organist, Leonard Hargreaves, was the next figure of interest. She knew precisely where to find him at that hour. Polishing the organ pipes in the cool gloom of the church, Mr. Hargreaves was a tall man, his shoulders slightly stooped as though the weight of his own severity pressed upon him. His hands were long, with the faint stain of polish on his fingertips, and his expression was one of habitual disapproval. "Good morning, Mr. Hargreaves," Miss Marple said pleasantly. He looked up, offering a stiff nod. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I suppose you've heard of the unfortunate disturbance at the schoolhouse. A most regrettable affair." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "So sad for Miss Finch." Further, his manner had told her more than his words. Her next encounter was not planned, but came about quite naturally on the high street. Young Peter Hollis, a boy of 12 with bright eyes and a perpetual scuff on his knees, was loitering near the sweet shop. He greeted Miss Marple with the easy cheer of youth, though his glance held a flicker of caution. "Good morning, Peter," she said. "Not at your lessons today?" "Half day, miss," he replied. "On account of the trouble." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Ah, yes, the trouble. You've heard all about it, no doubt." Peter shuffled his feet. "Everyone's talking. Some say I done it, but I never. I didn't touch no box, I swear it, miss." She regarded him kindly. "I had not accused you, my dear boy. But since you speak of it, Tell me, where were you at the time? I was fishing, Peter said quickly. Down by the brook. Caught 2 minnows, I did. Ask Tommy Blunt, he saw me there. Miss Marple nodded. Fishing requires patience. A useful skill. More useful, I dare say, than forcing locks. The boy flushed. I can pick a lock, though. Learned it from an old book. Not that I did this one, miss. Truly I didn't. Her expression was gentle. Boasting is a dangerous habit, Peter. It can put ideas into other people's minds. Best to remember that. He nodded earnestly, relieved, and darted off toward the sweet shop. Miss Marple watched him go, thoughtful. Mischief was in his nature, yes, but not malice. She felt instinctively that Peter was no blackmailer. Her final visit of the day took her to the home of Miss Clara Sims, the assistant teacher. Clara was a quiet young woman of 26, with a pale face and anxious eyes. She lived in a small cottage with her elderly aunt, who welcomed Miss Marple warmly before leaving the 2 ladies alone in the parlor. Clara's hands trembled as she poured the tea. It was dreadful, Miss Marple, she said. I've never been so frightened. When Miss Finch showed me the note, I thought I should faint on the spot. Miss Marple studied her carefully. Preferred hidden, Mr. Hargreaves. Stern and disapproving, with a slip of the tongue that hinted at knowledge he ought not to possess. Young Peter. Mischievous, but more concerned with minnows than secrets. And Miss Sims, nervous, hiding something she dared not name. 4 suspects, each with reason enough to have tampered with the schoolmistress's game, and yet none so obvious as to stand out. The mist had thickened, and the lamps along the high street glowed faintly golden. Miss Marple's step was unhurried, her mind weaving the threads of character and circumstance together into the beginnings of a pattern. People, she murmured to herself, are very much like riddles. The answers are there if only one asks the right question. And with that she let herself quietly into her neat little cottage, where the kettle waited to be boiled, and her knitting basket sat ready by the fire. Chapter 3. First clues in the schoolroom. The following morning broke bright and clear, the mist of the previous day burned away by a pale autumn sun. St. Mary Mead seemed almost too innocent in its golden light, the whitewashed cottages gleaming, and the hedgerows bursting with berries. But Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to know the difference between surface appearances and underlying truths, was not lulled by the day's serenity. There was a mystery in the village, and mysteries did not fade with the sunshine. She had determined to revisit the schoolhouse. Though the children were not due to attend until later that afternoon, Miss Finch had agreed to open the classroom for her inspection. A curious old lady might have been rebuffed elsewhere, but in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple was regarded with both respect and a little awe. Besides, the vicar had discreetly suggested to Miss Finch that her neighbor's sharp eyes might discover something the constables had overlooked. So it was that Miss Marple, wrapped in a neat tweed coat and with her walking stick tapping lightly on the cobbles, made her way toward the ivy-clad school building. The air was brisk, scented with damp leaves and the faint tang of wood smoke from chimneys. A pair of children, released early from errands, bobbed their heads. Rows of desks polished by generations of elbows. A blackboard faintly dusted with chalk. And at the front, the teacher's desk where the unfortunate wooden box still sat in its shattered state. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, making a patchwork of shadows across the floor. Miss Marple moved slowly about the room, her manner absent-minded, as though she were considering some knitting pattern. But her eyes missed very little. She bent first over the broken box, lifting the splintered lid with delicate fingers. The lock had been roughly forced. She traced the jagged edge thoughtfully. "Whoever did this," she murmured, "was in a hurry. A person with patience would have found a quieter way." Miss Finch clasped her hands together. "But surely that suggests a child. A grown man or woman would have more sense." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple mildly. "Yet one should never underestimate how foolish adults may be when they are frightened." She stooped to the floor, her sharp eyes scanning the dust beneath the desk. A faint glimmer caught her attention. She reached out and retrieved it. The same brass button she had pocketed yesterday, now examined more carefully in the bright light. It was of excellent quality, polished and embossed with a faint crest. Not from any school uniform, certainly. "Do you recognize this?" she asked, holding it out. Miss Finch shook her head. "No. It looks like the sort of button one might find on a gentleman's coat, perhaps." "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured. She slipped the button back into her handkerchief. "Buttons are dreadful telltales. They drop at the most inconvenient moments. I remember once, at a parish fete, a missing button revealed the identity of a gentleman who had overindulged in the brandy. He would not have thanked his tailor for sewing it on so loosely." Miss Finch smiled faintly, though her anxiety soon returned. "But what can a single button tell us?" "That," said Miss Marple, "depends entirely on whose button it proves had knowledge of your private correspondence. Letters, after all, are seldom written without consequence." Miss Finch paled, her lips tightening. "You mean the note found in the box?" "Yes, I feared as much. Someone must know more of my past than I had imagined." Miss Marple only patted her hand gently. "The past, my dear, is much like knitting. One may unravel it, but one cannot entirely prevent the wool from showing where it has been worked." With that she took her leave, promising to return if she discovered anything further. Outside, the air felt sharper. Miss Marple walked slowly down the lane, her mind busy. The button intrigued her most of all. She thought of the various coats and jackets she had observed in the village. Mr. Hargreaves with his brass-buttoned overcoat for church duties, Mrs. Price Ridley's tailored walking suit, even the vicar's Sunday jacket. Each detail was catalogued in her tidy mind. As she passed the vicarage, she paused to exchange a few words with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement. Mrs. Clement was a cheerful, bustling woman with a heart for gossip, though her intentions were always kind. "Terrible business about poor Miss Finch," she said, shaking her head. "I do hope it won't affect the children's lessons. Though between ourselves, I can't see the harm in a few riddles. Better than endless sums, I dare say." Miss Marple agreed politely. "Yes, children are fond of puzzles. But adults, my dear Mrs. Clement, sometimes find puzzles far less amusing, particularly when they concern their own secrets." Mrs. Clement looked startled, but Miss Marple merely smiled and continued on her way. By the time she returned to her cottage, she had resolved her next step. She would not confront anyone directly just yet. People she knew revealed more of themselves when they were unguarded. A casual conversation in the tea shop, a remark overheard at the post office, the careless slip of the tongue. These were the true keys to unlocking he begun. Chapter 4. Gossip at the Tea Shop. The next day dawned with a light drizzle, soft enough to dampen the hedges but not serious enough to keep the villagers indoors. In St. Mary Mead, a little rain was no deterrent to errands, especially when there was news to be shared, and the incident at the schoolhouse had provided the most delectable news in months. Miss Marple, who knew the value of village chatter better than most, decided that her morning's constitutional ought to take her past Mrs. Hartwell's tea shop. It was a small, cheerful establishment, known for its sticky buns and for being the unofficial exchange of local intelligence. If a matter was on the lips of St. Mary Mead, one could be certain it would be discussed over cups of tea and slices of fruit loaf at Hartwell's. The bell over the door jingled as Miss Marple entered, removing her damp gloves with the neat precision of habit. The warmth inside was welcoming, fragrant with baking, and filled with the hum of conversation. Several ladies were already gathered around the tables, their heads inclined close together, eyes bright with curiosity. Mrs. Hartwell herself bustled forward, rosy-cheeked and smiling. "Good morning, Miss Marple. A pot of your usual, I expect? And perhaps one of the bath buns? They've just come out of the oven." "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "That would be most agreeable." She settled herself at a small table near the window, perfectly positioned to hear without appearing to listen. Her knitting, of course, was produced at once. There was nothing more disarming than an elderly lady quietly clicking her needles while others chattered freely around her. At the nearest table sat Mrs. Price Ridley, her expression one of stern rectitude, and beside her Mrs. Bartlett, who rarely missed an opportunity to speculate. They were leaning close together, voices lowered in conspiratorial tones. "Well, I said from the beginning," Mrs. Price Ridley was declaring, "that these modern ideas would come to no good. Puzzles and riddles indeed. See where it's led. Blackmail in the schoolhouse, and I dare say worse to come." Mrs. Bartlett gave a little gasp of delight at the word. Black marks a curious detail indeed. Mrs. Bartlett leaned forward eagerly. "Letters, you say? But from whom?" "That," said Mrs. Price Ridley with relish, "is precisely the question. And I cannot help but notice how very friendly Miss Finch has been with Mr. Hargreaves of late. Seen talking in hushed tones after choir practice. They say Mrs. Bartlett's eyes widened. "Mr. Hargreaves?" "Surely not. He's as severe as a judge," Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "Severe or not, men are not above weakness. And Miss Finch is a handsome woman in her way. Mark my words, there is more in this business than meets the eye." At another table, Miss Hartwell's niece, who helped serve, was whispering to a friend. "My cousin swears he saw young Peter Hollis hanging about the school that morning. Says the boy had a guilty look, too. And you know how he's always boasting he can pick locks. If you ask me, it's as plain as day." The friend giggled. "Oh, but Peter's harmless, really. Mischievous, yes, but not wicked. Still, a lockpicker is just the sort who might break into a box for a lark." Miss Marple continued her knitting, her face serene. She sipped her tea when it arrived, delicate fingers steady on the cup. Outwardly, she was merely a sweet old lady enjoying a bun. Inwardly, she was sifting gossip like flour through a sieve, separating the coarse exaggerations from the fine grains of truth. When the conversation lulled, she rose and approached the counter to pay. Mrs. Hartwell leaned forward confidently. "You'll have heard, no doubt, Miss Marple, that Miss Finch is in a terrible state. Poor lady, she was pale as milk when she came in yesterday for her loaf. Some say she's thinking of leaving the village altogether." "Indeed," said Miss Marple gently. "That would be a pity. She is only just settled in." "Well, if half of what they're saying is true, she may have reason. It seems she's not so free of her past as she might wish." Miss Marple nodded, themselves more when they thought they were unobserved. Instead, she continued on to her cottage, where the kettle was soon singing on the hob. She sat by the fire, her knitting in her lap, the rain pattering softly against the window. The brass button still lay in its handkerchief, a silent companion to her thoughts. She reviewed the morning's intelligence, letters without postage, whispers of a connection between Miss Finch and Mr. Hargreaves, suspicions cast on young Peter, Mrs. Price Ridley's unshakable certainty that modern ideas bred wickedness. It was a tangle of threads, some knotted, some frayed, some leading nowhere. But Miss Marple knew from long experience that if one were patient and pulled gently enough, the true pattern would emerge. Her needles clicked on, steady and precise, as though the act of knitting could order her thoughts into neat rows. "Blackmail," she murmured softly. "A most disagreeable crime. It requires knowledge, yes, but more than that, it requires fear. Someone in this village believes Miss Finch will pay dearly to keep her past hidden. The question is, who knows enough to play such a dangerous game?" The fire crackled, the rain fell, and outside St. Mary Mead carried on its ordinary routines. But inside Miss Marple's tidy parlor, the real work of detection was quietly underway, stitch by stitch, thought by thought. And so, while the village gossiped, Miss Marple listened. She listened not only with her ears, but with her mind. For in gossip, as in riddles, the answer often lay hidden between the lines. Chapter 5. False Leads. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to brighter skies. The drizzle had cleared, leaving the hedges washed clean and the village greensward glistening with dew. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted how swiftly the village's mood had altered. Yesterday's whispers had been damp and heavy, like the rain. Today, with the sun restored, rumors sparkled and flew with renewed vigor. She had scarcely finished her breakfast of porridge and marmalade when there came a polite tap at her door. Opening it, she found Peter Hollis shifting nervously on the step, his cap in hand, cheeks flushed from exertion. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple," he said in a rush, "but I wanted you to know I didn't do it. Not the box, nor the letter, nor any of it. They're all saying I did, but I swear I didn't." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "Why, Peter, what makes you think people are saying such things?" The boy scowled. "I heard Mrs. Price Ridley outside the post office yesterday, saying I could pick a lock quicker than you could boil an egg. And Mr. Hartwell gave me such a look when I went in for sweets, like I'd pinched the whole till. But I never touched that box, Miss Marple. Truly, I didn't." She invited him in, offering a chair by the hearth and a slice of seed cake. "Now, Peter," she said gently, "why don't you tell me exactly where you were when the schoolmistress discovered her box had been forced?" Peter brightened, as though grateful for the chance to state his case. "I was fishing, ma'am. Down by the brook. I had my line and everything. The vicar saw me too when he went by on his bicycle. He even stopped to ask if I'd caught anything." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And had you?" Peter grinned sheepishly. "Not much worth showing. But my boots were wet through. I can prove it, ma'am. They're still drying by the stove at home." Miss Marple inclined her head. The alibi had the ring of truth. Boys might lie, but wet boots seldom did. "Thank you, Peter. I believe you. But do tell me." Herself to the grocer's. There she found Mrs. Price Ridley in full voice, relating once again her disapproval of the modern games encouraged by Miss Finch. "I said from the start it would end badly," she declared to anyone who would listen. "Secret games, indeed. And now the poor woman claims she's been robbed. I don't believe a word of it. If you ask me, it's all some scheme of hers to draw attention, or worse, to cover up impropriety." Miss Marple, selecting a tin of treacle with care, remarked mildly, "Oh, but surely, Mrs. Price Ridley, it would be a very foolish scheme indeed. To draw attention to oneself by staging a burglary, one would have to be most reckless." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "Reckless or desperate, people do strange things when they have secrets," Miss Marple observed her carefully. There was a high color in Mrs. Price Ridley's cheeks and an unusual brightness in her eyes. She was speaking with more than the satisfaction of gossip. There was an edge of agitation beneath her words. The grocer, Mr. Larkin, interjected cheerfully. Now, Mrs. Price Ridley, let's not be too hard on Miss Finch. She's always polite to me, and the children seem to like her." Mrs. Price Ridley drew herself up. "Children do not know what is best for them. It falls to us, the responsible members of the community, to guard their morals. And if that means examining what sort of influence this new schoolmistress is bringing in, then so be it." Miss Marple left the shop with her purchases and a thoughtful expression. Mrs. Price Ridley's zeal might be nothing more than the usual self-importance, but Miss Marple suspected there was more. When one protested too loudly, it was often because one had something to hide. That evening, Miss Marple took out the brass button once more, studying it under the lamplight. Polished, well-made, and not from a child's uniform. She was quite certain of that. Nor did it match the simple coats worn by the villagers in her acquaintance. Whose garment had once been adorned by it? The answer came sooner than she expected. The following day she paid a call. "Vigor. That woman has brought nothing but trouble. The village was perfectly respectable before she arrived. Now we have scandal, broken locks, and whispers of blackmail. It is intolerable." Miss Marple only smiled. "And yet, my dear, life would be very dull without a little excitement. Not that one should wish for scandal, of course, but human nature is such a curious thing. One learns so much from it." Mrs. Price Ridley harumphed, missing the glint in Miss Marple's eye. When Miss Marple returned home, she considered all she had observed. 2 false leads had presented themselves thus far. Young Peter, an easy scapegoat, and Mrs. Price Ridley, whose guilt in breaking into the box seemed likely, yet whose role in the matter might not extend to the blackmail itself. The note had a different flavor, a knowledge of Miss Finch's past, something more intimate than Mrs. Price Ridley's suspicion. Who then had both the means and the motive? Her thoughts turned again to Mr. Hargreaves, the church organist. A man of stern morals, yes, but with a surprising connection to Miss Finch, if the gossip held truth. Was it possible he knew something of her history? Or perhaps the timid assistant teacher, Clara Sims, whose nervousness might conceal knowledge she dared not confess. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, gazing into the fire. The pattern was not yet clear, but she had tugged at 2 threads and found them wanting. The true design still lay hidden, waiting to be revealed. For now, the village would continue its chatter, spinning falsehoods and suppositions. But Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, would wait. False leads were as instructive as true ones. They showed where the trail did not run, narrowing the possibilities. She smiled to herself, pouring a fresh cup of tea. "It is always so," she murmured. "One must let people talk. They will reveal more than they ever intend. And the truth, like cream, always rises to the top." The fire crackled warmly. Outside, St. Mary Mead settled into its evening rhythms, lamps being lit, curtained gracefully, setting her gloves on her lap. "I have been thinking about your unfortunate box. Such a very odd affair. And it occurred to me, Miss Finch, that perhaps something more than a prize pen was taken from it." Miss Finch's eyes flickered, the faintest betrayal of alarm. She composed herself quickly. "Why, whatever do you mean?" Before Miss Marple could reply, there came a soft knock at the half-open door, and Clara Sims slipped in, clutching an armful of exercise books. The young woman looked even paler than usual, her eyes darting nervously between the 2 older ladies. "Oh, I didn't know you had company," she murmured. Miss Finch forced a smile. "Only Miss Marple. Do put the books down, Clara." But Clara lingered, as though uncertain whether to stay or flee. Miss Marple regarded her with kindly interest. "Miss Sims," she said, "perhaps you can help us. I wonder if you happened to notice anything unusual about the contents of the schoolmistress's box before it was broken into." Clara's fingers twisted together. I'm not sure." Miss Finch's tone grew sharper. "Clara, really. This is hardly the time for idle speculation." But Clara's eyes were wide, troubled. "I did see something," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "A letter. Sealed. Miss Finch put it in herself, just 2 days before." "Clara!" Miss Finch's cheeks flamed. "That is quite enough." Miss Marple said nothing, her needles quietly clicking in her lap bag as though she had all the time in the world. The silence stretched until Clara blurted out, "And now it's gone." She looked stricken, as if the words had escaped against her will. Miss Finch rose abruptly, her face taut. "Clara, I must insist you leave us, at once." Clara gathered her books, nearly dropping them in her haste, and slipped out. The door closed behind her, and Miss Finch sank into her chair with a sigh. Miss Marple's voice was soft, but firm. "A letter, then. That was the true object, was it not? Mystery lay not in the forced wood and splintered lock, but in the vanished envelope." She paused at the stile leading to the meadow, resting her hands lightly on the weathered wood. A letter. Letters without postage, Mrs. Price Ridley had said. Perhaps the same hand? If so, then the box had been broken not merely for curiosity, nor for the value of a pen, but to obtain that one damning sheet of paper. And who, in St. Mary Mead, had the knowledge and the nerve to seek it? The next day, Miss Marple contrived to meet Clara Sims as she left the post office, clutching a small parcel. Clara looked startled, then wary, when Miss Marple fell into step beside her. "My dear," Miss Marple began mildly, "I hope I did not alarm you yesterday. It is only that such affairs are best understood clearly, don't you think? Silence, though well-meant, can sometimes make matters worse." Clara flushed. "I didn't mean to say anything, but I couldn't help myself. It was dreadful, Miss Marple, seeing that letter go missing. I knew it must be important, though I didn't know what it said." Miss Marple nodded. "Quite right. But perhaps you have an impression, not of the words themselves, but of the letter's appearance. One can sometimes tell much from a hand, even at a glance." Clara hesitated, then whispered. It was a man's hand. Bold, with heavy strokes. Not like Miss Finch's neat writing at all. Miss Marple tucked this away. A man's hand. That narrowed the field. Mr. Hargreaves came inevitably to mind, with his firm organist's script. But others too might fit. She gave Clara a reassuring pat. "You have been very helpful, my dear. And do not worry. You have done nothing wrong. Truth will out, as it always does." That evening in her own sitting room, Miss Marple laid the threads before her. A brass button belonging to Mrs. Price Ridley's coat. A missing letter, once locked in the box. Whispers of secret correspondence. A boy accused but innocent. A schoolmistress pale with anxiety, her past threatening to overtake her. Fall were as predictable as the chiming of the church bells. Villagers walked briskly to service in their best hats. Children were shepherded by parents with scrubbed faces and polished shoes. And Mr. Leonard Hargreaves, the church organist, presided from his loft with the solemn dignity of a man who considered himself the guardian of sacred order. Miss Marple, though devout in her quiet way, also recognized the village church as a place of observation. People revealed much when they thought themselves engaged in worship. Little glances exchanged, absences noted, post-service conversations that betrayed more than intended. She took her seat near the back, knitting needles discreetly tucked away in her reticule, and let her eyes roam over the congregation. Miss Finch was present, pale but composed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Clara Sims sat 2 pews behind her, head bowed, lips moving in silent prayer. Mrs. Price Ridley, naturally, occupied a prominent position near the front, her hat adorned with an extravagant spray of feathers. Peter Hollis wriggled beside his mother, earning a discreet tug on the ear. And above them all, Mr. Hargreaves's figure loomed, stiff-backed at the organ. His music was precise, almost martial, each note struck with uncompromising exactitude. To Miss Marple, it was less an act of devotion than of discipline, as though he meant to keep chaos at bay with the force of sound. After the service, villagers gathered in small knots outside the church, the air alive with the scent of damp grass and beeswax polish. Miss Marple, lingering near the lich gate, soon found herself in company with Mr. Hargreaves, who emerged after locking the organ loft. He inclined his head stiffly. "Miss Marple, always a pleasure to see you." "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Hargreaves," she said with her customary mildness. "Your playing was particularly strong this morning. I dare say the very rafters quivered." His thin lips curved in what might almost have been a smile. "The hymns demand firmness. There is too much laxity these days. In music, in morals, in everything." "Yes, quite. And yet, you phrased it as though you knew for certain. Those letters, you said, such a definite article. It makes one wonder precisely what you know." He cleared his throat, clearly flustered. "You misinterpret me, madam. I speak hypothetically, nothing more. Good day to you." With that he marched off, his shoulders stiff, his gait too rapid to be entirely natural. Miss Marple watched him go, her face composed, but inside she was quite satisfied. A slip of the tongue indeed, one that suggested knowledge he had no business possessing. Later that afternoon she paid a call on her old friend, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement. The vicarage was a cheerful, if somewhat untidy place, filled with books, children's toys, and the lingering scent of fresh scones. Mrs. Clement, a bustling, good-natured woman, welcomed Miss Marple warmly. "You must tell me, Jane," she said as she poured the tea, "what to make of all this business at the school. Half the village is in a fever of speculation. Poor Miss Finch must be at her wits' end." Miss Marple accepted a scone, spread it delicately with jam, and replied, "I think, dear, that speculation is often more dangerous than fact. But certain things do begin to show themselves if one listens carefully. For instance, Mr. Hargreaves appears to know about the letters in Miss Finch's possession, yet she herself has told no one of them, except perhaps her assistant." Mrs. Clement raised her brows. "Hargreaves? Surely not. He is so upright, almost painfully so." "Ah, my dear. One learns that uprightness can sometimes conceal the most curious inclinations. There are people who derive satisfaction from control, from knowing secrets, even from wielding them." "You don't mean—" Miss Marple sipped her tea calmly. "I mean only that his words suggest knowledge. And knowledge, as we both know, can be a weapon." Mrs. Clement shivered. "It's all very unpleasant. I wish it could be cleared up quickly." "So do I," said Miss Marple gently. "But puzzles, you know, must be supported by the vicar. And now, Mr. Hargreaves, betraying knowledge he should not have." The false leads had narrowed. Mrs. Price Ridley had likely broken into the box, but the blackmail note bore a hand too deliberate for her. She was a woman of blunt words, not cunning schemes. Clara Sims, timid and anxious, knew of the letter, but lacked the strength for mischief. Peter was mischievous, yes, but innocence shone plainly in his eyes. Which left Mr. Hargreaves. His discipline, his severity, his insistence on standards, and beneath it perhaps resentment. Resentment at Miss Finch's modern methods, at her popularity with the children, at the disruption she represented in the settled order of village life. If he had discovered some indiscretion from her past, it would be the perfect weapon. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click, yet something still did not quite align. If Mr. Hargreaves sought to blackmail her, why had Mrs. Price Ridley been found meddling with the box? Unless she had her own reasons, independent of his. Two players, perhaps, both circling the same prize. She resumed knitting, her expression serene. It was not yet time to speak. The pattern was almost complete, but one or two more stitches were required before it could be unveiled. For now she would wait, and watch, and listen. The truth, as always, would emerge. That night, as she sat by her lamp, Miss Marple recalled Mr. Hargreaves's words. If only she had destroyed those old letters at once. Old letters, not just one. Letters, plural. He knew there had been more than one. And he knew Miss Finch had not destroyed them. Such certainty could come only from one who had seen them himself. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "Yes," she murmured. "The slip of the tongue, Mr. Hargreaves, is the surest witness. One need only listen." Chapter 8. The Button in the Hedge. The rain fell softly, a tiny smear of brass polish on a fallen leaf. That was interesting. Not many villagers polished buttons anymore. She straightened slowly, her joints protesting, and continued along the lane until she spied a familiar figure bustling toward her. Mrs. Price Ridley, wrapped in a voluminous mackintosh and topped with a hat that bristled like a startled pheasant, came striding with her usual air of importance. "Why, Miss Marple," she exclaimed, "out in this dreary drizzle? One would think you hadn't a care in the world for rheumatism." "I find a walk clears the mind wonderfully," said Miss Marple with gentle cheer. "And there is so much to occupy one's thoughts these days. Why, only yesterday I heard the most curious tale. About a button." Mrs. Price Ridley's sharp little eyes flickered. "A button? Whatever do you mean?" "Why, the brass one found in Miss Finch's desk. Such a puzzle, isn't it? I believe it matches those on your mackintosh, does it not?" There was the faintest pause. "Possibly. Brass buttons are hardly rare, Miss Marple." "Indeed, indeed. And yet the polish upon them, such a bright gleam. Few people take the trouble these days. But then you have always been so particular, haven't you? Quite admirable." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed, half pleased, half wary. "One must uphold standards. Sloppiness is the curse of modern life." "Quite so. Only, I wonder how one of your buttons managed to wander into Miss Finch's desk. Perhaps it took a walk of its own?" The woman bristled. "Are you suggesting I broke into that desk?" "The very idea. I happened to be in the schoolroom last week, helping Miss Finch with the flower arrangements. Children are forever tugging at things. No doubt one of them found a loose button and tossed it aside." "Ah, that must be it," said Miss Marple mildly, though her eyes were keen. "Children do have such mischievous fingers." They parted with civil goodbyes, but Miss Marple walked home convinced she had touched a nerve. Mrs. Price Ridley had lied, clumsily too. Miss Finch's desk was open. I thought perhaps she had left it so herself, but then I noticed the window latch was unfastened. It gave me quite a fright. I shut it quickly and went home." "And you told no one?" Clara shook her head miserably. "I was afraid it would sound foolish. And Miss Finch was so troubled already." Miss Marple nodded. "You did what you thought best. But tell me, Clara, did you notice anything else? A scent, perhaps, or a scrap of cloth?" The girl hesitated. "Well, there was a smear of mud on the floor, and something shiny, but when I bent to look, it was gone. I suppose it rolled away." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. "A second button, perhaps." The pattern strengthened. After Clara left, Miss Marple sat in her chair and reflected. Mrs. Price Ridley had been in that schoolroom searching for the letter. She might not be the blackmailer, but she was certainly complicit. Why? For gossip? Or something more? That evening, at the Women's Institute meeting, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Price Ridley again. The woman held court with her usual authority, but her hands betrayed her, fiddling with her coat hem, avoiding the buttons. Yes, Guilt lay there, barely concealed beneath the bluster. Miss Marple rose during the break and joined her, remarking conversationally, "Such dreadful weather, isn't it? One's clothes suffer so. I myself lost a button once during a storm. Most inconvenient. I remember it precisely because it led to such a peculiar discovery." Mrs. Price Ridley froze. "A discovery?" "Oh, yes. Buttons tell tales, you know. One only has to follow where they lead." For a moment the woman's mask slipped. Fear flickered across her face, then irritation. "Really, Miss Marple, your imagination runs away with you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must speak to Mrs. Bartlett." She swept off, feathers trembling. Miss Marple watched her go with quiet satisfaction. Pattern would be clear. That night, sitting by her fire with her knitting in her lap, Miss Marple murmured aloud, "The button belongs to Mrs. Price Ridley. But the hand that wrote those letters, that belongs to another." And she set her needles clicking again, patient and serene, waiting for the moment to reveal the truth. Chapter 9. Gathering in the Schoolroom. The following Wednesday dawned bright and clear, as though the heavens themselves had grown weary of drizzle. The village roofs glistened, and the hedgerows steamed softly in the sun. Miss Marple, who had been knitting by her window since dawn, laid her work aside with an expression of quiet resolution. The time had come. She had thought carefully, weighed every clue, and now saw the design entire. Yet, as with all puzzles, it would not do to blurt out the answer. People seldom believed what was merely told. They must be shown, step by step, until they recognized the pattern for themselves. And so Miss Marple resolved to arrange a small gathering in the very schoolroom where the mystery had unfolded. She enlisted the help of the vicar, who obligingly suggested that, since so many villagers had been distressed by the recent unpleasantness, perhaps it would be well to meet and clear the air. Invitations were sent, politely phrased but firm. By late afternoon, 5 figures assembled in the cool, chalk-scented classroom. Miss Finch, pale and fluttering. Clara Sims, timid as ever. Mrs. Price Ridley, bristling with indignation. Mr. Hargreaves, stiff and watchful. And young Peter Hollis, who fidgeted nervously with his cap. Miss Marple sat serenely at the teacher's desk, her small hands folded upon the blotter. She looked, as always, the very picture of mild spinsterhood, yet her eyes twinkled with quiet authority. "Thank you all for coming," she began in her gentle voice. "It is only right, I think, that matters be settled here where they began. We have, after all, endured some distress of late. Accusations, suspicions." Marple with unruffled calm. "Yet one wonders, dear lady, how an accident carried you through the hedge by the schoolyard, left brass polish on the leaves, and smudges of mud upon the floor. One also wonders why you rifled through Miss Finch's desk at all. I think perhaps you sought the letter yourself, not to write the note, for that required too subtle a hand, but to possess it, perhaps to wield it in your own way." Mrs. Price Ridley's lips compressed. "I may have suspected something. I thought it my duty to know the truth, for the good of the village." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "So often mischief is done in the name of duty. But no, You are not the blackmailer. Your actions were clumsy, impatient. The blackmailer's notes, by contrast, were precise and deliberate. Her gaze shifted, unhurried, until it rested on Mr. Hargreaves. The organist stiffened. This is absurd. I had nothing to do with it. Miss Marple smiled almost kindly. I think you did, Mr. Hargreaves. You see, you spoke one careless sentence after church, that Miss Finch ought to have destroyed those old letters. Letters, plural. Yet Miss Finch confided in no one, not even Clara here, that she possessed more than one. How then could you know unless you had seen them yourself? A murmur rose in the room. Mr. Hargreaves's face drained of color, then flushed dark. I merely assumed. Ah, but assumptions are seldom so precise. You knew, Mr. Hargreaves. And more than that, you used your knowledge. You slipped notes under Miss Finch's door, threatening exposure unless she yielded to your demands. The handwriting, I dare say, will prove yours if one compares it with the choir ledgers. The phrasing, too, so exact, so firm. It is the very voice you use at choir practice when scolding a singer for flat notes. Clara Sims gasped softly. Peter stared wide-eyed. Mr. Hargreaves's hands clenched. Sniff, but said nothing. Clara Sims looked relieved, while Peter's young eyes shone with a curious admiration for Miss Marple. The organist sagged at last, his pride collapsing. He sank onto a bench, covering his face. Perhaps I overstepped, he muttered. Miss Marple rose, her small frame radiating quiet authority. You did more than overstep. But let us not dwell on punishment. That will be for others to decide. What matters here is that the truth is known, and that Miss Finch may go about her work unmolested. Miss Finch, pale but resolute, lifted her head. Miss Marple, I cannot thank you enough. You have lifted a terrible weight. My dear, said Miss Marple with a smile. Weights are meant for kettlebells and coal scuttles, not for gentle hearts. Now, let us draw this matter to a close. Tea will be ready at the vicarage, and I think we could all do with a cup. One by one they filed out, subdued and thoughtful. Mrs. Price Ridley muttered about scandal avoided, but her eyes held a grudging respect for Miss Marple's unflinching clarity. Clara Sims whispered her gratitude. Even Peter managed a solemn, "Thank you, Miss Marple," before dashing off like a colt released. Only Mr. Hargreaves lingered. He paused at the door, his face a mask of defeated pride. You see too much, Miss Marple. Far too much. She regarded him kindly. It is not difficult, really. People tell one everything if one only listens, even in the smallest slip of the tongue. He bowed stiffly and left. When the schoolroom was empty, Miss Marple gathered her things and stepped into the bright afternoon. Birds sang as though the world were fresh-washed. She drew a deep breath of the clean air, her eyes twinkling with quiet satisfaction. The pattern, at last, was complete. Chapter 10. Tea at the Vicarage. Feel myself quite surrounded. You were. Miss Marple said gently, stirring her tea. But not in the way you thought. You see, the threats against you were never truly about your past. They were about power. And when one understands that, the pattern becomes quite clear. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed loudly. Power, indeed. I suppose you mean Mr. Hargreaves. Shocking business, though I always did suspect he was too stern by half. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she began a new row. Yes, Mr. Hargreaves was the blackmailer. His sense of order, his severity, gave him both motive and method. He discovered your old letters, Miss Finch. I believe quite by chance, when you asked him one afternoon to lock the schoolroom window after choir practice. He saw them in your desk and could not resist prying further. Miss Finch flushed scarlet. It was foolish of me to keep them. Not foolish, my dear, Miss Marple said kindly. Sentimental, perhaps. We all keep things we ought to burn. But the letters themselves were of little consequence, a girlish attachment, a youthful indiscretion. They would have harmed no one, had they not been discovered by a man who saw in them an opportunity. Clara Sims raised her eyes timidly. But why the notes under the door, Miss Marple? Why not speak outright? Because intimidation works best from the shadows, Clara. Mr. Hargreaves wished to instill fear, to make Miss Finch bend to his will without his name ever being attached. And he very nearly succeeded. Peter piped up suddenly, eyes bright. But then what about the button? Everyone said it was mine at first. Miss Marple smiled. Ah, yes, the button. That was another matter altogether. It belonged to Mrs. Price Ridley's mackintosh. She, too, had been meddling. The formidable lady bristled. Really, Miss Marple, must you repeat it? I admitted as much. I thought it my duty to see what was going on, and if I happened to lose a button in the marking errors, it was his voice in ink, if one cared to hear it. Miss Finch's eyes filled with tears. How can I ever thank you? You have saved me from ruin.
My dear,
said Miss Marple softly,
there was no ruin to be saved from. A youthful folly is no crime, though others may try to use it so. The real danger lay in fear, and fear has now been vanquished.
Clara Sims sighed in relief, and even Mrs. Price Ridley softened enough to murmur,
Well, perhaps the schoolmistress may not be so unsuited after all.
Miss Marple looked around the cozy table, her gaze lingering on each face.
And that, you see, is the true lesson here. Secrets are heavy things, but they only harm us when wielded against us. A village thrives not on judgment, but on understanding. If we choose to look kindly upon one another, much mischief loses its sting. There was a comfortable pause as the company absorbed her words. Then Peter reached boldly for a second bun, and laughter rippled through the room. The tension of the past weeks melted away in the warmth of tea and fellowship. Later, as the gathering dispersed into the cool night, Miss Marple lingered a moment by the fire with Mrs. Clement. The vicar's wife regarded her friend with admiration. You have done a great kindness, Jane, she said. Not only to Miss Finch, but to us all. Left to itself, this matter would have festered. Now it is closed. Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their quiet click. Closed, yes. And yet one hopes we have all learned something. Pride and gossip may stir up storms, but patience and a little observation can restore calm. Mrs. Clement patted her hand fondly. St. Mary Mead is fortunate to have you. Oh, not at all, Miss Marple said, eyes twinkling. I merely notice what others overlook. People are so very much alike, you know, whether in grand houses or village cottages. Their little vanities, their fears, their slips of the tongue. It is all quite revealing. She rose, gathered